I'm Meta Spencer. Let's go to Singapore today. I think Singapore is just one of the most magnificent cities in the world. And I kind of envy our guest today because he lives there. It's a beautiful place, one of the most modern places I've ever seen. So, but I haven't been there since 1980. And so we get a new visit
Changed a
today.
lot.
Really? Okay, this is James Dorsey, who's a senior fellow or something at the Middle East Institute of Singapore's National University. Have I got that close to right?
Absolutely.
That's terrific. Well, he's a journalist. He covers Asia and the Middle East and North Africa and all these other places that are so obscure to the rest of us. And today, what I've asked him to do, along with my assistant, Adam Wynn, who's here to help me interrogate this poor man, I'm going to ask him to give us kind of a basic course on what are the dynamics of all of these states and jihadist organizations in the region. And by the region, I'm not sure how big a region it is. It certainly includes China, Russia, India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran, Tajikistan. That's sort of, those are the main countries, as well as maybe Saudi Arabia. I don't know. Those are the countries that are big players in the region right now, and they seem to be all jiggling around trying to find a new position with respect to each other after the victory of the Taliban. So I have only the haziest idea of what's going on, but we're all going to get smart together. So whip out your notebooks and take notes because James Dorsey is about to enlighten us all. Good morning, James Dorsey.
Good morning. That's laying down a significant challenge, but we'll give it a try.
Well, we have an hour, so let's do it.
Sure.
Okay, so what has happened? I've read two recent pieces that you've sent us. I should say that how I got to know you, which is, of course, I don't know you. This is the first time we've met. So I hope we get acquainted. But you've been sending for the last 2 or 3 years, you've been sending me and Peace Magazine an article every week or so. And I'm sure you send them to other papers and publications as well. But you keep us busy just reading your pieces. And they're all very astute. So because I've seen so many of your works, I thought it was high time for us to get acquainted. And the two pieces that I read most recently, one of them had to do with a meeting that was to be held of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, is that the name of it? Which is a Chinese outfit, basically dominated. And another is I think it was about the status of the various jihadist groups in Afghanistan after the Americans leave. So tell me more, sir.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. And I'm delighted that what I write is of interest. It's indeed become a syndicated column that I've been writing for the past 10, 11 years since I left the Wall Street Journal. I think there are two ways of looking that are fundamental to looking at what the fallout of the US withdrawal from Afghanistan. One is that we're looking at rivalries within rivalries, which makes it very complex on one level. But on the other level, what we're really looking at is the United States pulling out of Afghanistan for all practical purposes, at least as far as we can see now, abandoning Central Asia and making all of this a problem for the regional players, rather than a problem for the United States or others. And the regional players include the Central Asian states, first and foremost, those states that border on Afghanistan. They obviously include Russia, even though Russia does not border on Afghanistan, but Russia has a history there. This is the second time that a superpower has been defeated in Afghanistan in the last 4 decades. They include China, which does have a border on Afghanistan, and particularly a border on Xinjiang, the northwestern province, which is home to Turkic Muslims, including the Uyghurs, and primarily the Uyghurs, who are experiencing suppression, if not cultural genocide.
The Chinese are certainly not very gentle with the Uyghurs, and how do other countries in the region feel about that?
The Chinese benefit from the fact that the Muslim world, by and large, with very few exceptions and only at specific times, has abstained from criticizing Chinese policy in Xinjiang, and in some cases even endorsed Chinese policy. So there is, from the Chinese point of view, there is a security interest here, which I'll come to in a second. And there is the interest of wanting to maintain that support, maintaining a longstanding alleged principle. I'm not sure that I believe it's in it, that the Chinese don't interfere in the affairs of others as a standing principle of their foreign policy. What I think is a far more greater concern to the Chinese is the fact that there are Uyghur fighters in Afghanistan. First of all, there's an Uyghur community. Part of that community goes back to the early 20th century. I mean, these are families that emigrated because of Chinese policies at the time already. Okay. And there's a number, we don't know how many really, of fighters. These are Uyghurs who had gone to Syria, fought with the Islamic State or other groups, and were among the foremost and the best fighters in Syria, very, very accomplished, who are now have made their way back to Afghanistan. Now, if you look at, I personally suspect, so coming back to the second story that I wrote that you were referring to, we can go deeper into it, but let me touch on one aspect of that, which is there are multiple groups, militant groups in Afghanistan. And those groups differ from one another. It's very, sure, you can categorize them under one label, militancy, whatever you want to call it. But what their games are, what their scope of activity is, what their geographic focus is, even what their ideology is, differs vastly within that category. So Chinese policy has been to force countries or persuade countries to return Chinese nationals of Uyghur descent, whether or not they were involved in a militant group. So you've seen expulsions from Egypt, from Malaysia, from Thailand. So prima facie, there's no reason why the Chinese would not want the expulsion of certainly Uyghur fighters, if not other Uyghurs, from Afghanistan, which puts the Taliban in a bind, because they have a history of, no matter what the cost, look at Osama bin Laden, not extraditing those that have helped them in their cause.
Okay.
Now, the question is, I suspect that there's an unwritten, maybe even consensus, which China may not be part of. But if the Taliban can control these groups, ensure that they do not launch cross-border or transnational operations, then that may be a better solution than a situation which the Taliban would not extradite them, but let them go, leave the country quietly, and you would lose sight of them. You would lose the ability to survey and monitor what they do, even if the US ability of monitoring in Afghanistan is significantly diminished with the withdrawal. Now, whether the Chinese would buy into that notion, I think is questionable. Coming back to your question, so you have the Islamic State, whose regional branch in Afghanistan is at war with the Taliban. They view the Taliban as traitors because the Taliban negotiated a solution with the United States. They also differ. They still believe, whether they're capable of not, that being a second question, in these spectacular transnational attacks, as they committed in Paris and in Brussels and in other European countries. Then you have Pakistani.
Did you say they are the worst of the lot in terms of violence and extremism?
Probably, yes. Then you have Al-Qaeda, obviously was responsible for 9/11, but they've fundamentally drawn the conclusion from the US invasion of Afghanistan that these spectacular actions ultimately put them on the defensive and risk their existence. And so therefore they have moved towards much more local activity, trying to create a grassroots basis through good governance and issues like that. And then you have geographically focused organizations that do not have any global ambitions. The Taliban is one of them. Let's keep in mind that the Taliban have never launched operations outside of Afghanistan. They were not really in favor of what Al-Qaeda was doing. And this extreme loyalty to those who supported them at whatever price is not rooted in Islam.
Oh.
It's rooted in their ethnic culture, the Pashtunwala, and the rules and regulations, informal, but nonetheless, as they exist within that culture. That's what that is rooted in. It's not rooted in religion. I'm not saying that they don't have a lot of religious roots, and there's a lot of debate about the accuracy of those interpretations, but nonetheless, their willingness to host, no matter what, is not a religious obligation.
I see. Okay.
And then you have groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba, Lashkar-e-Jhangvi, which are Pakistani backed, focused on India because of the Indian-Pakistani divide. You have the Uyghurs who, yes, they went to Syria, but they went to Syria basically not because they believed fundamentally in global jihad, but they wanted the experience of the fight so that they could take that back to, what better school was there? So, that was their motivation. It wasn't, their motivation is not bombing the trade tower in New York. It may be bombing it in Kashgar or Urumqi in Xinjiang. So, with other words, you have a vast scala of groups here. And the Taliban are trying, to be fair to them, they are trying to get control of this. So you have the violence and the confrontations with the Islamic State. You have deals with some groups, particularly the pro-Pakistani groups, in terms of where they will be allowed to be based within Afghanistan and what they can and cannot do. You have Al-Qaeda, which doesn't want to sign an agreement with them, even if they are loyal to the Taliban, because they don't trust the deal with the Americans, and they don't trust what deals the Taliban may or may not cut with the Russians and the Chinese.
The Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And also there's this other thing called Khorasan or something. It starts with a K.
Khorasan.
Khorasan? Yeah. Okay.
It's the regional affiliate of the Islamic State. So it's the Islamic State Khorasan.
Okay. So all those three are more like-minded, and the Taliban would be more local, warlord kind of orientation. Am I hearing that?
I'm not sure I would say warlord orientated.
Okay.
They are an Afghan movement focused on Afghanistan that is ultra conservative, if not, I don't know how to express it in stronger terms, ultra conservative in their religious outlook, which guides them. And they're militant. I mean, they've fought wars for the last 25 years. But they actually came out of basically a disgust with a post-Soviet Afghanistan in which the warlords were running rampage. And they were a response to that.
What are the Hazara?
Shiite minority. So the Hazara account for 20% of the Afghan population. The vast majority of the Afghan population is Sunni Muslim. The Hazara, who are present in Afghanistan, but also in Pakistan, particularly in Balochistan, but also elsewhere in Pakistan, are 20% of the population. They've not had an easy ride in Afghanistan, particularly not under the Taliban, because the ultra-conservative forms of Islam are often deeply anti-Shiite. And so they've suffered quite a bit, which means that Iran's relationship with the Taliban is a balancing act, because it doesn't want trouble on its eastern border. It needs the cross-border trade, but it is the center. It views itself, in any case, as the center of the Shiite world. And therefore has a responsibility towards or feels a responsibility towards the Hazaras. So they're walking a fine line.
These other guys, all of these other jihadists that are more international in orientation, is it fair to say they have something in common? The Islamic State, Al Qaeda, and what was one other?
They all have things in common. Where there are differentiations are partly in strategy and tactics, and in fine points of interpretation of Islam in different ways, coming out of different schools of thought. I think for our purposes in this, I mean, that's all interesting if one is really intrinsically interested in all of this. But if not, what is ultimately I think two things. It's important to understand if you're a policymaker, because those differences make a difference in terms of what policy you will have towards them. And it's important to understand because basically, the Uyghurs are a threat to the Chinese. They're not a threat to the Europeans, the Americans, whoever it may be. The same is true for those groups that are focused on India, or on Uzbekistan, or on Tajikistan. The group that today is most focused on trans-border, cross-border operations is the Islamic State.
Are there parallels between the experience of the Uyghurs in the Chinese context and the Tatars in the Russian context, with them both being Muslim minorities within a broader country's population? But their treatment, I've heard that the Tatars in Russia and in Central Asia also face a lot of discrimination, forced erasure, and other problems from the larger regimes. Is that true?
The answer is yo. Yes and no. So, with other words, they have, and there is discrimination in Russia, but there is not a systematic attempt to change the culture, to change the demography, to try and curtail physically the numbers that, by for example, curtailing births. That I think is uniquely Chinese.
All these neighboring countries, I'm not sure, if we're talking about Russia, China, India, countries that you would think would be quite clear about what their attitude is toward this new regime. I don't hear much clarification. Have they really taken a clear position, each of them? And if so, what is it?
Well, I think that basically first of all, there's a debate. And the debate is between fundamentally the West, which sees sanctions as the way to get the Taliban to comply with what the international community by and large wants, and the international community being defined here not as it often is as the West, but including the West distractors, the Russians, the Chinese, and others who are not necessarily Western detractors, the Indians and the Gulf. So there is, in a sense, agreement on, we want an inclusive government, we want women's rights, we want you to ensure that militants don't run rampage, and so on. The disagreement is, how do you achieve that? Mm-hmm. The West basically thinks it has to be achieved through coercion. And you start doing this stuff, then we'll make life a little bit easier for you. Whereas others believe that you can coax the Taliban into becoming more moderate, if you wish, by trying to bring them into the international community and being inclusive with them. That opinion is perhaps to some degree starting to fray at the edges. So you saw today that Qatar, which has played an extraordinary role in helping the Americans negotiate, no matter how flawed it was, a withdrawal from Afghanistan, having played a major role in the evacuation itself. The foreign minister was in Kabul, first senior foreign official to visit Kabul since the Taliban takeover a couple of weeks ago. And today he's come out and said the performance of the Taliban is very disappointing and taking Afghanistan a step back. Now, he hasn't broken with, he's still calling for inclusion of the Taliban, but I think his remarks today were partly a way of pressuring the Taliban, but also an expression of frustration. The Chinese have called for lifting the blockade on Afghan funds in Western banks and with multilateral institutions like the World Bank. The Russians and the Central Asians, fundamentally, most are hedging their bets. Tajikistan is openly supporting the remnants of what's called the Northern Alliance. So a combination of the forces in the Panjshir Valley that have been that are Tajiks, ethnic Tajiks opposed to the Taliban, the vice president in the Ashraf Ghani government that was supported by the Americans, and Ghani having fled as the Taliban moved into Kabul, and a warlord again, of Tajik descent. So you've had a very checkered and very different response to what's happening in Afghanistan. But I think what everybody's hoping, and it may be hope against better, it may be wishful thinking, that you can get what people have called a Taliban 2.0. You certainly don't have a Taliban 2.0 today, even if this is a group that's become far better, not good, but far better in their communication strategy.
I wonder whether there's a real discipline within the Taliban. These guys are sort of rough and ready street fighter kind of guys, or maybe countryside fighters, and headed by some people who make policy. Now, if the people sitting in, the chambers of Kabul now make a decision that, yes, we're going to be nice to women and allow them in the government or things like that, or we'll stop beheadings in public or some other, what we would consider very fundamental kinds of changes or very basic kinds of changes. If they make that policy, do they really have enough control over the guys in the streets to inform that and to control them? Or is it the case that some of the fighters have their own values and intend to uphold them, these conservative traditional values, and no matter what their bosses tell them?
I think your guess is as good as mine.
Mm.
First of all, the vast majority of the Taliban have never left Afghanistan.
Mm-hmm.
If they've left Afghanistan at all, it was to Pakistan. But even that would, I would think that most even haven't been to Pakistan. A number have been out since the office of the Taliban was opened in Doha and Qatar under US auspices, so that there was a place for the Americans and the Taliban to meet. And obviously, so they've been exposed to a different world. And they're now back in Kabul. But, much of their rank and file has not. Now, they've fundamentally admitted that. So at one point, they asked women in Kabul to stay home, not on the basis of an Islamic principle that they put forward, but on the basis that they needed to retrain their forces to get used to see women in public, even if they were fully covered or whatever, but nonetheless. So implicitly, that was an admission that there's a transition going on here that hasn't taken place. So we don't know how a moderation, if there were to be a moderation of certain policies, how that would go down with the rank and file. Now, I also think that you've got to realize that part of the rank and file are not necessarily, first of all, Afghanistan is a conservative country. And Kabul is not Afghanistan.
Okay.
And so there are significant parts of Afghanistan that remain very conservative, very traditional. And the Taliban have popular support. Part of the Taliban rank and file are not necessarily people who joined the fight because they were deeply religious. Part of them are people who joined the fight either because they were sick and tired of war and they saw this as a way of ending the violence, or because they simply needed the money and were being paid as members of armed forces are paid. So we don't really know, and we don't know what the balance is in those things. Mm-hmm. So, as I said, your guess is as good as mine.
We hear conflicting things about girls will be allowed to go to school through grade school, but not beyond. you know, how many women are going to have to wear these ugly things over their heads and so on. Will women be allowed to have professions? Will there be any women in the parliament or in the government at all? All of those things seem to be very unsettled yet.
Well, I think some things are clear and some things are not.
Okay.
It's clear women will be allowed to have women's university education. They've been very clear. They've been very clear about that.
All right.
It's not how many women have to wear a full head and facial and body cover, and how many not. All women have to wear it.
And they will again now, for sure.
Well, what you've seen is a lot of women simply either doing that preemptively, or not leaving their homes, or what you've seen protests by women who were not wearing the full garb, and there was the Taliban forces who tried to repress those demonstrations. So I think it's not. So I think those things are clear. What's not clear is whether the Taliban are going to put a token woman into government. They haven't so far. And in term, and the record, if you look at this government, there are very few representatives of minorities. There are Tajiks, Uzbeks, one Hazara, but in a cabinet of whatever it is, 30 something, that's not very much.
Now, you haven't mentioned India at all, and nobody ever does in connection with Afghanistan. I'm not sure I understand why. Am I just not hearing what's being said, or has the Modi government taken a great distance, held itself at great distance from anything going on in Afghanistan?
No, I think that the Modi government is, like everybody else, hedging their bets. But there have been meetings with the Taliban. They've certainly heard the Taliban spokesman talk about wanting relations with India, particularly commercial relations. The Taliban may well have an interest in India as a counterbalancer to Pakistan, because that Taliban relationship is a very complex relationship. It's not Simon Says, if you wish. India continues to want to use Afghanistan through a port in Iran as a gateway to Central Asia. So, it's playing this. It's playing this low key, but that doesn't mean that it's not there.
Okay, now let's talk. We've mostly talked about people in their relation to the new status in Afghanistan, but you also had a very interesting paper about the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and that they were going to be having a meeting, and there was something about the question of whether or not to include Iran. And that seemed to have a lot of ramifications. Can you give us a view of what what is the history of the SCO, and why it matters, what difference it makes, whether they include Iran?
Well, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization was established about 20 years ago by under Chinese leadership, and it included Russia, and it included some of the Central Asian states. And it was subsequently expanded by making both India and Pakistan full members. it has various countries, and the focus really was security at the time. It had various countries which were granted observer status, that included Iran, and there were various countries that had what was called a dialogue status. Iran's rivals in the Middle East, so Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates primarily, and others, had no status and had not requested a status with the SCO. By and large, membership is approved unanimously, which was one reason why Iran's request to be upgraded from being an observer to being a full member was never requested, because that would have effectively given Iran a veto over the membership of, for example, Saudi Arabia. The Russians and the Tajiks this time sponsored Iran's membership. And I think that partly is a result of, or to a large extent, is a fallout of Afghanistan. And at the same time, Saudi Arabia, Egypt were given dialogue status at the SCO. And so basically, they're walking a fine line. But if you assume that there's going to be some sort of dialing down of tensions in the Middle East as various rivals in the region talk to each other and try to find mechanisms to manage their disputes and conflicts, not resolve them, then the issue of Iranian membership in the SCO could become less of a problem for the Chinese and the Russians.
Did they have that meeting, and what happened? Because the piece that you wrote was before the meeting, and I think it must have happened by now.
Yeah, no, the piece was written several days before the meeting, and the meeting was, off the top of my head, on the 16th and 17th of September in the Tajik capital of Dushanbe, where Iran's application was accepted for the first time. Oh. Now, there's a process. It takes a couple of years bureaucratically before all of that is in place. But the fact is that for the first time, Iran's application was accepted and is being processed.
Okay, so they relented, or they maybe that means that they feel this. Well, okay, you said that they were being excluded because they didn't want the Iranians to have a veto over the Saudi membership, etc.
I think that's part of the reason. The other reason, of course, is sanctions.
Say again?
Sanctions. Iran is under US sanctions. Iran is what I think is very important here, Iran is no longer under UN sanctions. And that helped open the door, because even though the United States claims extraterritorial legal authority, its sanctions are bilateral. It is the United States sanctioning X. It is not the international community speaking through the Security Council sanctioning X. And so with the Iran nuclear accord, the UN sanctions were essentially lifted.
So that makes it easier for them to accept.
There's no international law binding them, or banning them from doing so.
Okay. Well, that makes a certain amount of sense, I guess. Do you anticipate that the U.S. sanctions will be lifted? Do you think they'll restore whatever agreement they had, or come to a new one?
This is with the Taliban or with Iran?
I'm talking about JCPOA or whatever.
JCPOA. Well, I think it's going to be tough. I think that one, it's going to be tough, and there's not that much time to make it worthwhile. At the end of the day, the Americans, I mean, I would agree with someone like Robert Hunter. The Americans simply should have gone back to the deal.
Mm-hmm.
Fact of the matter is, the Americans signed an agreement and they left the agreement.
Mm-hmm.
And then they came back and said, we're going to come back to the agreement, but we want to get some extra out of this.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, if somebody signs a deal to buy your house, then says, I'm walking away from this deal unilaterally, you can do what you want. And if you want me to come back, then you've got to, build an annex. You're going to say, look, you walked away from the deal. I didn't.
Of course.
It's as simple as that. Yeah. But I think that the opportunity, if you wish, to turn this around from what was, I think, a fundamental mistake when Trump walked away from the agreement, is becoming increasingly difficult. And you're dealing with a government that's very different from the past government in Iran. Mm-hmm. And it's been made that very clear.
Okay, now you say the Shanghai Cooperation Organization was created for security reasons, but the security reasons are very multidimensional. And right now, I think I would ask, what are the implications of having all these neighboring countries join? Because China's main issue seems to be with Taiwan and, well, Hong Kong too, but Taiwan is the real threat, I would think. And what would the attitude of the whole organization, the SCO, be toward an attack, let's say, on Taiwan by China?
Well, first of all, I mean, it's a regional cooperation agreement, and it's focused on Central Asia, really. That was the purpose of that. I don't think that, look, at the end of the day, let's face it, and I would argue it was a mistake, but that's neither here nor there. The United States has recognized China's one China policy. That was the basis on which Nixon went to Beijing. Recognizing, there was no deal without the one China policy. The one China policy is Taiwan, Hong Kong, a part of mainland China, period. That's You're
very flat-footed on this.
Yeah, I am. No. I mean, what I'm saying is that is what the one China policy means. And everybody who's established diplomatic relations with China has fundamentally accepted that. Now, the United States has moved away from that in some ways. What that means in practice and to what degree the United States is going to go to war for Taiwan, we'll have to wait and see. The Chinese will. And I think that nobody in the SCO is going to make this an issue for them with the Chinese.
You think that China will go to war against Taiwan, period?
I think, no, I think that the Chinese do not want a war. And as long as they're not fundamentally challenged on Taiwan, they're probably willing to let this ride for a while. There's going to be a point where they won't. Now, what's going to, there's some statements out of Beijing that talk about 2040. They probably would not have reacted in Hong Kong the way they reacted if you hadn't had a protest movement. It wouldn't have been that much skin off their teeth. There wouldn't have been a challenge to their authority in that way, a challenge that could, spark flames in the mainland. Obviously, Taiwan is different because there is no Chinese oversight. The Chinese may claim that it's part of China, mm-hmm. but they have no say in the way that they have a say in Hong Kong.
Mhm.
And so demonstrations matter less there in a sense. And it's going to be more about degrees to which their claim to Taiwan is challenged internationally. So upgrading of relations with Taiwan by the United States, or by various, but particularly by the United States. But you're also seeing similar steps. Take the city of Prague in the Czech Republic, which has flown the Taiwan flag from the city hall, and they've been very supportive of Taiwan.
I didn't know that. That's interesting.
And you've had harsh Chinese economic responses to those kind of things. So I'm not saying there is going to be war by definition. I'm saying it is something China would go to war if it felt there was no other alternative.
That is a very disturbing thing, for people who, I'm doing my best to hang on to my faith in democracy and the importance of supporting like-minded Democrats in the world. And I'm having a harder and harder time of it as democracy seems to be flailing and making terrible mistakes and full of stupid politicians. But to actually just say I don't care is hard for me, and I think for a lot of folks.
No, I appreciate that, and these are very tough issues. But what I do think, I mean, if you take a step back, in my mind, we're at an inflection point globally, at which the plates are shifting, the balances of power are shifting, but also the way one has approached all kinds of things is being questioned, and questioned with good right. The Americans have, militarily failed over the last 20 years. Or if what they achieved at a very heavy price, not only in terms of, blood and treasure and what have you, but toppling Saddam Hussein, and there's no defense of Saddam, but in the way it was done, empowered Iran.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And it wasn't thought through in that way. There is a debate going on in the United States and in Washington in terms of what the fundamental drivers of U.S. foreign policy should be, and how that policy should be executed, and whether or not you have a strong reliance on the military in that sense.
Yeah.
Beyond the fact that what constitutes warfare is shifting. So it's no longer, the infantry going to march. It's in space, it's in cyber, it's in all kinds of realms that are not, where the military is a player, but not the only player.
With the global economies and many countries shifting or hoping to shift away from oil-related ventures in the next decade or two, how do you see the Central Asian republics evolving? Because some of those countries, I'm thinking of Turkmenistan, for example, the very autocratic regime that relies almost entirely on natural gas and oil revenue.
It's good to look at the Gulf for some guidance on that. So what you're seeing in the Gulf is, short and middle term, a bet on fossil fuels, whether it's oil, where the Saudis are doubling down, or natural gas, for example, with the Qataris, but at the same time, a recognition that you have to start diversifying. Now, the country that I think has gone the furthest in that is probably the UAE. You're seeing elements of that in Kazakhstan. you're seeing elements of that understanding in Uzbekistan.
Mhm.
You're seeing none of that understanding in Turkmenistan,
Yeah.
and which saying is autocratic is an understatement.
It just amazes me that country continues to exist in that circumstance into the 21st century. It is just absolute lunacy.
It's been like that. I mean, I've visited it quite often.
Yeah.
It's been like that from day one.
You were
First of all,
a reporter for the Wall Street Journal, right? And you traveled around a lot then. Do you still do that, or is it even necessary anymore?
well, first of all, I mean, I was based in 15 different places across the globe. Many 9 or 10 of them in the Middle East and the region, the greater Middle East. So over the years, I've obviously built a network that I can rely on. Up until the pandemic, I was on the road 60 to 70% of the year.
Mm-hmm.
The last time I traveled at this point was March last year.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
For a variety of reasons. One, Singapore has been very successful, even though it's now got an outbreak again, but by and large been very successful. But if you could leave, but coming back was very questionable, so you didn't leave. Second of all, what's the point of going to a country where it's worse than it is in Singapore and sitting in a hotel room because you don't want to go out? I mean, I don't go out in Singapore even. Mm-hmm. So in the last year and a half, it's been communicating with people by phone, by text, by email, what have you, depending on some people run greater risks than others do. And keeping my finger on the pulse, obviously, by monitoring what's happening through news media, other online sources, and hopefully next year. I mean, I'm writing a book. I desperately need to travel for it, and I don't see that happening before next year.
Mm-hmm. To what extent do you feel that you are jeopardizing the safety of your informants? I'm thinking Modi. Am I right in saying that his regime is the most anti-democratic tendency in the region? Or am I just listening to the wrong people? And I talk to people, when I interview people there, they have to be very careful. And I wonder if you find that's the case too, that he's really got people scared.
He's got people scared. I mean, is he the worst? I don't think he's the worst. I mean, somebody like Abdel Fattah al-Sisi is far worse. Mm. Maybe even Mohammed bin Salman. Mm-hmm. Recep Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey has people afraid. I'm known to protect sources. Okay. And I've fought major libel cases that I've won that have become landmark cases that have changed law to protect sources. I deal with people who feel comfortable dealing on a phone, to people who I know well, who are fugitives today in their country. Mm-hmm. And I'm very cautious.
Okay, now finally, what's this thing about soccer?
I actually, okay. I'm not a soccer fan.
Oh, really? Nor am
I a sports fan. But what happened is that on the eve of the 2010 World Cup in South Africa, I wrote a piece that sort of tried to explain the political reasons why Middle Eastern countries weren't performing particularly well in World Cups. The piece got published, and a friend of mine who's a very successful writer, a soccer fan, and a soccer player, as are his children, phoned me and you said, you have a book. And so, sometimes you need somebody to say something to you for the penny to drop. So what I was at the time looking for was a way to write a book that was not going to be the umpteenth memoir or an analyst's analysis that differed from others by the way I cross the T's or dot the I's. And this gave me just a very different prism. And it turned out to be a phenomenal prism that, one, because it was much more rooted in history than I had ever recognized in terms of the role that soccer played from the 19th century on in almost any development in the Middle East. And it took me all the way through the popular Arab revolts of 2011 until a point somewhere in 2014, 2015, where it no longer served that purpose as a prism to look at fault lines in the region. I just never had the courage because in a sense, I branded myself with the title. And so I'm close, I'm getting to the point where I'm going to change it, but should have probably done so some time ago.
Change it, from not being your identity connected with Middle Eastern soccer, or are you going to expand your identity, or what's the story? I think it's fascinating because I'm just puzzled by how come all of these articles keep coming at me about Middle Eastern soccer.
Well, none of them are about Middle Eastern soccer anymore, but they come under the title of the column, the blog, which still is what it was. And, a number of friends and family and whatever said to me, you got to change this. This isn't about soccer anymore. And it raises questions, as it does with you. And so I'm looking, one possible title I'm looking at is calling it Inflection Points.
Mm-hmm. All right. That sounds good. That's a dandy word. All right. This has been great. Thank you very, very much. And now we're acquainted. I've been wanting to meet you forever, but.
Well, it's been my pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
All right. Take care. Bye.
All the best. Take care.